Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SAG-AFTRA podcast. I'm Duncan Crabtree, Ireland SAG-AFTRA National Executive Director and Chief Negotiator. With our commercials contract expiring on March 31st, 2025, we're beginning to prepare for negotiations with the Joint Policy Committee, which represents advertisers and advertising agencies. This is one of our most important contracts, generating roughly $1 billion annually in earnings for SAG-AFTRA members. To help break down the key elements of our commercials contract and explain what members need to know as we head into these talks, I'm joined by two experts who bring extensive knowledge and insights into the commercials agreements. First of all, Katie Von Til. She's an actor, singer, and the national chair of the Commercial Performers Committee, as well as national co-chair of the Commercials Contracts Negotiating Committee. And Tracy Hyman, who's the national director of the Commercials and Corporate Educational Department at SAG-AFTRA. Welcome, Katie and Tracy, and thank you so much for doing the podcast with us today.
Absolutely.
Happy to be here, Duncan. Thanks.
So let's start out explaining who it is that we negotiate with and what role the Joint Policy Committee, or what I'm assuming we'll call the JPC for the rest of this podcast, plays in the commercials contract.
So the Joint Policy Committee is made up of advertisers and ad agencies. We do refer to them as the JPC. And they're the organization that sits across the table from SAG-AFTRA and negotiates for terms under the contract. Anyone who authorizes the JPC to negotiate on their behalf automatically becomes legally bound to the terms of the commercials contract and commit to making only commercials under the union contract. During the 3-year term of the contract, we work closely with the JPC to make sure that the contract is being enforced and that our members are protected.
Cool. Anyone want to add anything to that, Katie?
Yeah, sure. I'll just add a little bit.
Add a little flavor.
It's mostly advertising. Yeah, it's mostly advertising agencies that belong to the JPC, although there are some advertisers as well. But basically, anybody who's signed as an authorizer through the JPC gets a seat at the table.
Sounds good. And I'm glad we've got the JPC, because the joint part of the policy committee is these two organizations that both have like really long names and acronyms, including the AAAA and the ANA, right? So thankfully, this all combined into this one negotiating committee on the other side. And so maybe talk just for a second about how our side of that negotiation works. I mean, I'm assuming a lot of our listeners sort of are generally familiar with negotiations, but we also have a committee, right, Katie? And you're the national co-chair of it. Maybe you can just, obviously we keep the identities who's on that confidential, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what it's like to be on a committee and sort of who it's made up of.
Basically, just to give a little bit of background about the process, the first step in that process is having the wages and working conditions meetings, colloquially referred to as the W&Ws. And that's when our membership, SAG-AFTRA members, get together and talk about things that are working for them with the contract, things that aren't working for them with the contract, everything related to pay, what happens to us on set, auditions, the booking process, you name it. So it starts there for us. And then during that process, we fill out our negotiating committee. Now, our negotiating committee is made up of 17 members from all over the country, and as well as 17 alternates. We travel to New York, for those of us that aren't in New York, to have lots and lots and lots and lots of meetings over basically a 7-week time frame to try to nail it all down with our employers. And I will say, this last round, and even the round before, our employers in this contract, the JPC, they really are our bargaining partners. They only exist because our contract exists. So it's in their best interest that the contract stay alive and well. And we try to look for not just ways to make actors' lives better, but solutions that our employers need in order to keep work union and keep it in the country.
Wow. So, that's sort of the fundamentals of negotiation, right? Which is there's got to be some give and take, and hopefully we can find win-wins for that process. And boy, that's a commitment to do an in-person negotiation for so long, huh?
It sure is. And before we have negotiations, we actually have what's called the National Plenary, and that's when everybody on the negotiating committee, as well as staff, gets together in Los Angeles to go over our proposal packet. And that's where we take everything that was moved through the W&W's process and whittle it down into something that we feel is appropriate to push across the table.
That's great. Now, people say, and it's true, that there are two contracts that are kind of being negotiated together during the course of this negotiation. Tracy, do you want to enlighten us as to what that means?
Sure. There's actually the commercials contract and then the audio commercials contract that are being negotiated. So the commercials contract are what you think of audiovisual commercials that you'll see streaming on social media, on television, et cetera. The audio commercials contract, which used to be called the radio contract, is only audio. There is no visual component to those. And that's what you'd be listening to in the car, listening to the radio, or if you're listening to Spotify or iHeartRadio, something like that. Those are the commercials that are going to be covered under the audio commercials contract. So we do both at the same time. A lot more time is spent with the commercials contract, but we certainly focus our attention to the audio commercials contract and make sure that the performers working under that are just as protected and are paid and can make a living under that type of work.
Yeah, and also that contract feeds into AFTRA pensions as opposed to SAG pensions. So it's another way that we keep that pension strong and alive.
Oh, really appreciate you mentioning that, Katie. That's an important point. So I thought maybe we could talk about some of the specifics under the contract. So we're gonna hit some highlights, but anything that we don't highlight today, maybe we'll highlight in a future episode. Doesn't mean it's not important. And number two, no one should infer anything from what we're choosing to talk about today in this podcast in relation to our proposals. At the time of recording this podcast, we haven't decided what proposals to make yet. We're still in the middle of that W&W process that Katie described earlier. Maybe we could start out by talking about performers. And specifically, we have principal performers and background performers, which are called extras under this contract. Can we talk a little bit about what the difference is between those two categories of performers in this contract specifically and how that plays out and how that works?
I can dive in explaining a little bit about extras and background. As you referenced, under this contract, we call background performers extra performers. And that's because background is actually a term of art under this contract. When we look at a scene in a commercial, we look at to see where are people standing. Are they in the background? Are they in the foreground? What kind of atmosphere are they creating? And if we were to call our extra performers background performers, but yet they're up in the forefront of the commercial, it would become very confusing, especially when we look to how performers who are hired as extras can be upgraded to principal performers. There are three criteria that the performer has to meet. And one of those is, where are they located in the scene? Are they where the action is happening? So again, we have to look at the foreground, the background, and where the action is happening to determine their location. We also look to see if they're identifiable and if they're responding or reacting to the message of the commercial. And all three things have to happen at the same time. But it's for that really specific reason that we don't call performers background, but we call them extras. And then, of course, there's the principal performers, and that can be anywhere from alone in a close-up shot, choreographed individuals, speaking a line, stunt performers. So that's what we're looking at when we're looking to see who are the principal performers in a particular commercial.
And then, of course, off camera, it would be, the voiceover of the spot, right? The announce. And when we're talking about the audio commercials contract, it can be all kinds of things. The announcer, there can be partner reads and that sort of thing. But there's no extras. There's no extras in audio.
There's no, right. That makes sense, actually, when you think about it. So Tracy, when we talk about upgrades, so you were just describing some of the differences between sort of what constitutes extra work and what constitutes principal work under the contract. So obviously, if someone maybe is engaged as an extra and then they do something that qualifies as principal work, then they would receive an upgrade to principal, I presume?
Yes, and they can always file a claim if they think that they meet those three criteria at the same time. They would file a claim with our department. We review the final edits, because that's what we have to look at, is what is in that final edit. And actually, our reps from across the country, we all look at the commercial and we all review it based on the contract principles to come to a determination if we are going to pursue for the upgrade. And of course, if a performer is upgraded, then they become eligible for residuals.
Which is yay, right? That's a good thing.
It's the only thing keeping me alive and keeping food on my table right now, literally.
Yes, absolutely. So actually, Kate, let me turn to you if I may. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the audition process. What do you feel like are some of the most important protections in this contract relating to auditions that performers need to know about and or maybe don't know as well as they should?
Well, something that a lot of performers don't know as well as they should is how long we're allowed to be at an audition before overtime kicks in. There are rules that keep us from being delayed from getting to our next audition. It's something that actually you'd think is, it's just for actors and, punishes other people, the advertiser or the casting director. But really, it's to help the whole ecosystem flow well. It's so that everybody can get where they need to be on time. And I will say to the members, please remember to sign out. Please make sure you memorize and put your SAG-AFTRA number down there on that little piece of paper. But Tracy, you want to talk about the overtime?
No, absolutely. So the Exhibit E, which is the technical name of the form that Katie was referring to, we have them both. If you go into a live audition, there'll probably be a piece of paper. And we also developed in 2022 a online Exhibit E. So if you're doing a live virtual audition, you can fill that out online as well, and they come directly to us. So for your first and second audition, for the first hour, there is no additional payment. But if you do go over that hour, you are eligible for overtime, which is why it is so important that you are filling out that Exhibit E. Everyone should be filling it out. And please use your SAG-AFTRA ID.
Yeah, and then a little bit about the audition process. Aside from in-person or signing out this Exhibit E, we have 3 different types of auditions, basically. We've got in-person, and then we have virtual auditions, and there are 2 types of those. There are live over, a video platform of some sort. And then we also have self-tapes. And self-tapes are exactly what they sound like. I'm sitting here right now in front of my background with my studio lighting, and you tape your audition at home and you send it in. One of the protections we do have recently is at some point they got in the habit of saying every self-tape was due ASAP. And we're like, you can't say ASAP. You got to have a time certain. But it's still a challenge for a lot of actors. If you have a spare room like I do, you're very lucky. If you don't, putting a tripod on your bed as you move your pictures off the wall or hang a sheet, you name it. Actors are really multi-hyphenates now, in a sense that when we do these auditions, we are often our own readers. And then, of course, I'm my own cinematographer and my own editor.
I would just add, I think Katie pointing to her backdrop is a great point, that in 2022, after seeing a lot of very demanding and challenging requests, including filming yourself while driving for your self-tape or going out into the woods and walking over a stream, we put a lot of language in to protect performers so they wouldn't be able to be asked or required to do anything outside of their home or anything that's dangerous. So all they can require is a well-lit backdrop, just like Katie has. And it's perfect. And as long as you can mime or act out whatever they're asking you to do, they can't require you to have different hairstyles or to change your outfits. They can't require you to change the angle of your camera during a particular take. And they can't require you to have any particular props or equipment. So in 2022, we were able to put in a lot of protections into the self-tape.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And let me just say, for those who are listening to this as an audio podcast, I can attest that Katie's backdrop is in fact well lit. And yes. So
my key light, I got it all. You name it.
Oh yeah, it's excellent. Let's take a little detour, or turn really. It's not really a detour. It's a major turn in the road, so we can talk a little bit about residuals, because we were talking about this before and how important they are. We touched on that. So let's talk about that and how they're structured. And we made some pretty significant changes in the residual structure in 2022. Can we talk a little bit about that as well? And
I'll let Tracy get to the nitty gritty on this. But I will just say, I think what we did is, I mentioned earlier how these are our bargaining partners and we are looking for solutions. And I think one of the solutions that they were looking for was simplification, right? We streamlined some of our areas of reuse, which I think made things easier for them as far as being able to predict what they might be spending on talent.
Absolutely. In our prior to 2022, for our use types, if it was cable, they had to know exactly what cable channels they were going to be running it on. If it was a wild spot, they had to know exactly what cities or markets they were going to be buying it on. So it was very complicated to be able to predict what the payment was going to be. But in 2022, other than for Class A and for DigiNets, we put in flat fees. So now everything is based off of a 4-week, 13-week, or 1-year period of time. And then we just look at the platform. So cable has a set rate, Wild Spot has a set rate, with a little bit of a bump if New York and LA are included. So we really made it that it's predictable now, both for the performer to have an idea of what they might be getting and for the industry to be able to predict what it's going to be. We also combined internet and new media into traditional digital and pulled out streaming platforms. So that also was a nice way to simplify how people were looking at traditional digital and not worrying about if something was for the internet or something was for new media and how that worked.
So, I mean, this contract obviously has a lot of specialized terminology and maybe a little bit of jargon in it. So maybe, Tracy, for those who might not know, what's a wild spot?
Sorry, as I was saying it, I thought to myself,
fantastic. I mean, who wouldn't want to be part of a wild spot?
Come on now.
So there's something called Class A and there's something called wild spot. So if you're watching television, let's say must-see TV on Thursday nights, and everyone around the country is watching the same show in the same commercial break, everyone sees the same commercial, that's going to be a Class A, which is paid per use. But if people in LA see something different than people in West Palm Beach, Florida versus New York, those are going to be wild spots, because that's when an advertiser is targeting particular cities or markets that they want to highlight their product in versus what is generally known as a national buy. So wild spots when they pick and choose, but you're seeing it in those must-see TV, the Today Show, things like that.
Wild. Okay. Sorry. Boom.
Duncan.
I mean, it does sound like maybe it actually helps with maybe reducing some confusion. You were talking about how internet versus new media being combined into traditional digital, but then streaming is separate from traditional digital, I guess because it's not considered as traditional. I always thought that the distinction between internet and new media was slightly confusing just because the terms don't line up obviously, I think, for a layperson with what exactly they mean. But now we don't need to worry about that, right? We don't need to care about what the difference between internet and new media was, because now all we have to care about is there's traditional digital and there's streaming. Is that right?
Exactly. We don't have to define or research a particular new platform to figure out what it was created for. It's a much simpler, easier, more self-sufficient way of determining where your commercials are going to be placed and airing.
And Katie, if you are a successful commercial actor and you book a spot, a desirable commercial, how would you compare the importance of the residuals and the use fees for that with let's say the session fee, for example?
Well, the reason we are paid, again, basically for reuse is because they're using our likeness. And that's why we are paid. Again, a lot of people think, why are you paid so much for one day of work? But that's not really what it is. And the other thing is with commercials, it can be a detriment to talent to get too associated with a particular type of product because advertisers don't want their product tied to somebody else's product. Imagine that. Even if those things aren't necessarily conflicting products, it can just be a negative for advertisers who are trying to cut through the noise. And they can't just have the same face over and over again, because then people don't know what they're looking at.
Yeah, we've had litigation and arbitrations over those exact points. And I'm really glad you said that, because it leads right into the next topic we're going to talk about, which is exclusivity. So from my point of view, obviously not as an actor, but as someone who's worked with actors for a long time, including in this contract, use fees are really, really important because most actors don't get to work every day. And so, you spend so much of your time finding the job, then you do the job, and then, especially in the commercials area with exclusivity, as I'm about to ask you about, that limits what other jobs you could potentially get. And so you have to put this package of compensation together so that someone can actually make a living doing this job. So maybe, Katie, you could start off, and then Tracy, you can jump in on exclusivity and holding fees and how that works to protect performers.
The other reason that we're paid for our reuse, you mentioned actors spend most of our time trying to get auditions, right? It's not even necessarily auditioning. It's trying to get auditions, then auditioning, then callbacks. And it's very, very hard, and harder than ever before to try to juggle that with a day job, other side hustles. And so I would say to those people who want to employ actors, commercial actors, they need to have an available workforce. And the way we are available is if I'm getting repaid for my likeness so that I can be available during the day to go to their auditions. And then Tracy, handing back to you for exclusivity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we were talking about exclusivity or being held. not being able to do competing products. So if Katie did a commercial for a soda, they're going to hold her exclusive to other sodas. She'd be able to do an alcohol commercial or a milk commercial, but would be held exclusive and couldn't do other soda spots. To ensure that the company has the right to use it, but that she's also being compensated for not being able to go out for other jobs, we have what's called the holding fee. And if they're not using the commercial during a particular time, but they want to keep Katie exclusive to that product, she needs to be compensated for a period of time if they're not paying for use. If they're paying for use, then that's going to compensate her for the period of time that she can't go out for a competing spot. So the holding fees that performers are paid, while they are applied to the use payments, if there is no use payment, they're still being compensated to keep that exclusivity and to keep making sure that they aren't going out for those competing products. Once they're released, they're free to do any commercial that they're eligible to audition for and hopefully get. But during that time when they're held exclusive, they really do need to be compensated for that restriction on being able to get out and do other work.
Yeah, that's so true. And I mean, when, folks, maybe listeners who aren't actors or who have, more traditional like office jobs, if you think about it, it's like if you had an agreement with your office job that if you left or when your job came to an end, you couldn't go work for anybody else doing the same kind of thing. I mean, can you imagine that? That's exactly what most people do. Like if they get laid off, the first thing they do is go find another job doing the same kind of thing that they were currently doing for a similar type of employer. So if you have an agreement that says you can't do that, then you definitely need to be compensated because you've basically been locked out of the exact type of work that you most likely would be going to secure. So let's talk about some other specific protections that the contract addresses, including let's talk about hazardous scenes and intimate scenes. What do you all want to say about that? Because I think those are both areas where contractual protections are really important.
Yeah. In 2022, we put in some great language, I think, especially for nudity, partial nudity, intimate scenes, where not only does a performer have to be notified in the breakdown that the actual job may include some of that type of work so that they're able to make a decision, do I even want to go for this job or not? But production now has to provide someone ahead of time, once you're hired and before you set foot on stage on the set, they have to provide you someone to speak to. So you can ask questions of production like, what am I going to be wearing? Is it a 2-piece bathing suit? Is it a 1-piece? So they can get really comfortable with what the scene is and make sure that they understand it fully before they step foot on set and actually do the work. And I think that gives a lot of comfort.
Absolutely. And just to be completely dead honest, I have played both a nudist and someone in a bathing suit in a commercial. Different commercials, but that did happen. And sure enough, playing the nudist, you're not nude. You are the illusion of nude. But that was an interesting. That was an interesting fitting.
It's a nude illusion.
That's right, a nude illusion. I will say that was an interesting fitting. It was probably one of the more creative uses of various types of things that the costumer came up with. But it went really well. And sure enough, you watch the spot, it looks like we're nude, but we are not.
Duncan, you had also mentioned hazardous work and like stunts. So again, just like with this, in the breakdown, they have to identify if you're going to be doing anything hazardous or doing a stunt. And if they don't tell you in advance and you show up on set, then there are protections in the contract of whether you don't feel comfortable doing it all and you feel like you need to leave because it would be dangerous, or receiving a bump for doing it even though you hadn't been given advance notice. And one of the other pieces that we put in 2022 to the self-tapes were that no one can be asked anymore to do Ginsu knives juggling or stand near fire or crawl up on a ladder.
You laugh, but those things happen. Those things absolutely
I'm not allowed
happen.
to juggle Ginsu knives in my self-tape audition at home while I'm trying to get the Ginsu knife commercial. That's crazy.
Especially if you are not a professional.
Oh, wow.
So we put language in there that protects you, keeps you safe. I mean, if there wasn't a self-tape and you went to a live audition to do that, they would have a stunt coordinator. They would have protections for you. It should be no different when you're auditioning from home. You should absolutely have those same protections and safety around you.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's maybe talk a little bit now about this growing digital landscape. We talked about before the old days when we had to worry about the definitions between internet and new media, but the contract continues to look to address the sort of evolution of digital technology as it relates to the contract. So maybe talk a little bit about how the contract addresses that, especially the vast expansion of social media and its power in the world, and also streaming.
Yeah, the advertising landscape, the way commercials on advertising are delivered to the consumer, it has become so splintered. There are so many different ways to deliver that message to potential buyers. So while we are trying to get more simplified, the industry is actually becoming more complicated.
Absolutely. So we worked really hard to align ourselves really with the future. And that took a lot of work and faith and thoughtfulness on everyone's part, especially the performers who are on the committee, to make that happen. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure that where people were watching TV is where we were making a shift to. And that's where streaming came in. So while we still have social media and we have what's called certain special social media terms that addresses use only on social media, we developed traditional digital, which includes social media, but as well as websites, retail spots running on news programs, things like that. And then we separated out streaming. And when a company buys streaming, they do get traditional digital and social media as well. But the added is that streaming. And that's why we were really looking at how we could capture that, because that's where the eyeballs, right, are moving. But even since 2022, there's been so many changes. I'm sure by the time we finish this podcast, there's going to be another change that we're going to have to factor for. Yeah. So we're constantly looking at that environment to make sure that we're capturing the value that our performers bring. But it's also different because they're being delivered differently. Like Katie said, when you're watching streaming, as opposed to the way I said before, if you were watching Thursday night must-see TV and everyone was watching it across the country, now, if you're watching it on streaming, Katie is going to have a different commercial, Duncan, than I get, because they're becoming more focused on who they're targeting. So it's a completely different even type of exposure than it's been in the past. And it has different value because they're able to target it.
And does that streaming encompass everything from, say, YouTube to Hulu or Netflix with ads, or do you break that down any further than that?
Right now, it includes YouTube.com is considered part of traditional digital, but YouTube TV, and then all of the Roku, the Hulu, Peacock, all of those extra Hulu, Disney, those are all considered into the streaming bundle.
Absolutely. And do you want to mention anything about the influencer waiver as it relates to sort of this continued evolution?
Sure. So while you might not regularly think of an influencer as someone who is a commercial performer, they absolutely are doing a commercial for the products that they're being hired for. And the key thing that the advertisers like is they know that the influencers that they're using have viewers, have followers that are going to be on the same page as the influencer who's showing the product. And so we do cover those. We have an influencer agreement that's outside the commercials contract. And we have the influencer waiver, which is under the commercials contract, depending on what company is going to be hiring and who they're using. But the idea really was to say that this is commercial work. This is advertising. It's just a new way of advertising to reach a different group of people.
Absolutely. Well, as we move into sort of wrapping this up, because unfortunately we only have so much time in this podcast, but I can't wrap it up without us talking a little bit about AI, of course. This is, a topic that's at the forefront of everyone's mind, I think, working in this industry in any capacity, and certainly for performers. So this contract actually has, even though it's in a way before its time, it has some provisions already that relate to AI. Can you talk about that?
Well, I'll kick it over to Tracy, but we've got stuff relating to digital doubles. We also have our dynamic audio waiver.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, 2022, we were ahead of the curve on this, and we did get language in that essentially said you cannot use this type of technology or technologies that's developed tomorrow or in 100 years to evade the commercials contract and to avoid using our members or compensating our members under our contract. And we've already had the opportunity in the commercial space with VO to address some of the AI and really make sure our performers are protected and being paid and are aware and are consenting to the use of it. So we've already have a pretty good start in this space and look forward to where else we can go.
Yeah, and I think there's some uses of AI that can be, welcomed by some performers. There's some performers who don't want AI whatsoever involved in their lives at all, and I totally get that too. I imagine people along those lines are probably, happy to have seen the relatively negative reception of this high-profile Coca-Cola ad featuring AI digital replication. Either of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll comment on it. It's, it's a little bit uncanny valley, right?
Yeah.
There's that. The other thing is, for me, at least, those Christmas time Coca-Cola commercials were always very nostalgic. So for me, it was about nostalgia. And I think that's what they were trying to go for. But when there's no real human element to it, it feels false. And I don't think that's effective.
No, and performers bring heart and bring emotion, and that doesn't necessarily come through with the AI people that were on the screen for that spot. It's that nostalgia doesn't come through and speak to you the way that a performer does in a commercial like that.
Yeah. And that's something that, human actors really are the only source of that. I really don't think
AI can't drink a soda. AI can't drink a soda. It can't.
And it can't make you feel like it knows what it feels like to drink a soda. So we've talked a lot about all these different protections, and rightfully so, that are in this contract. Suppose that you are an actor. How best to address contract violations? What can members or performers who are working under our contract do when something isn't done the right way?
This is my big thing. Call the union.
Call the union.
Call the union. Yes.
File a claim. You can do comm.coedinfo@sagafter.org. Send an email. We'll send you back the link. You can go on the website and go to contracts, claims, and we have a claim portal there. You can go on to the commercials part of the production center and find the claim portal. But absolutely, this is your opportunity to let us know, the staff know, what is happening out there and allow us the opportunity to enforce the contract and make sure that you're protected and all of the terms and conditions are consistently enforced.
Great. So they could do that by calling. They can do that by the claims portal that you mentioned. They can do it through email. So basically any of those modes of conversation. Can't do it by TikTok just yet, but you can do it all of those other ways.
No pigeons.
No pigeons and no TikTok for claims reporting.
Yeah, if it's a safety issue, you want to call the safety hotline, right?
The safety hotline.
Yeah.
Right. 24/7. Yeah, and so since we're saying it, let's just tell everyone that number is 1-844-SAFER-SET. So you can call that hotline 24/7, 365. It is always answered and by a human, not by an AI. Really, Katie Von Til, Tracy Hyman, thank you so much for being here on the SAG-AFTRA podcast today. It was a wealth of useful information. All right, see everybody at the next SAG-AFTRA podcast. The SAG-AFTRA podcast is produced and edited by Aaron Goddard and John Small. Supervising producers are Pamela Greenwald, Shira Reich, and Michael McNulty, with production and marketing support from Damon Romine, Jolico Conte, Delaney Howard, Margot Giordano, Joe Mulgado, May Wong. The podcast is hosted by yours truly, Duncan Crabtree Ireland.